Test Your Might is one of the most iconic minigames in fighting game history, and it's been reinvented so many times across 30 years that the version you remember probably depends on when you grew up. From a simple button-mashing pit stop in an arcade cabinet to a fully animated, character-specific spectacle, this minigame has had one of the wildest evolution arcs in gaming. So let's break down every single version, starting with where it all began. Mortal Kombat, 1992. The original Test Your Might wasn't part of the fighting. It wasn't tied to the story, it wasn't a finishing move, and it definitely wasn't something you needed to win. It was a bonus round, a points-farming pit stop squeezed between bouts in the 1992 arcade original. And on the surface, it looked about as deep as a puddle. Your character stood over a block of material. You hammered every button on the cabinet as fast as humanly possible to fill a gauge. Once the gauge crossed the threshold, you hit block, and your fighter karate chopped straight through it. That's it. No timing tricks, no rhythm mechanics, no hidden combos. Just raw, blistering speed from your fingers to the machine. But here's where the design gets sneaky. There were 5 materials, and they scaled in both difficulty and reward in a way that was almost cruel. Wood gave you 100,000 points, which sounds generous until you realize diamond was worth 2 million. That's a 20 times multiplier from the easiest material to the hardest. Stone sat at 200,000, steel at 500,000, and ruby hit the million mark. Each one required you to fill the gauge higher and higher, meaning your button mashing had to physically get faster with every stage. And here's the part that tripped up almost everyone who played this game in 1992. In single-player arcade mode, Test Your Might only appeared after every 3 consecutive wins. The arcade mode itself ended after 12 total fights against Shang Tsung. Do the math, and that means you only got 3 shots at Test Your Might in a full playthrough. 3. You'd see wood, stone, and steel. Then the game was over. Ruby and diamond? You literally could not reach them unless you knew the secret. To access the full material lineup, you had to play 2-player mode, where Test Your Might triggered after every 5 consecutive battles between 2 human opponents. The complete experience was gated behind grabbing a friend, feeding the machine more quarters, and actually going head-to-head long enough to unlock the harder tiers. The majority of players in 1992 walked away from that arcade cabinet thinking they'd seen everything Test Your Might had to offer. They'd seen barely half of it. But the weirdness doesn't stop at the arcade version. When Mortal Kombat hit home consoles, the Genesis port quietly changed the numbers. Ruby dropped from 1 million points down to 750,000. Diamond fell from 2 million to just 1 million. No announcement, no patch notes, just a silent rebalancing for a different audience. Even in 1992, before Day 1 patches were a concept anyone had heard of, the developers were already tweaking Test Your Might behind the scenes for different platforms. The whole thing was beautifully deceptive. On the surface, you had the simplest minigame imaginable. Press buttons fast, hit block, break thing. Underneath that, you had a layered reward system with a difficulty curve most players never fully experienced, a multiplayer gate that hid the best content, and platform-specific rebalancing happening without anyone noticing. For a bonus round that lasted maybe 15 seconds per attempt, it packed a surprising amount of design intelligence, and it set the template. Every version of Test Your Might that came after this one would be measured against the original's simplicity. But the next time it showed up, simplicity was the last thing on the menu. Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance. Test Your Might disappeared after the original game. No Mortal Kombat 2, no Mortal Kombat 3, no Ultimate, no Trilogy, nothing. For nearly a decade, the minigame that defined the first arcade cabinet just vanished from the franchise entirely. But on November 22nd, 2002, Deadly Alliance brought it back. And it didn't just bring it back. It brought it back better in almost every way imaginable. The first thing you'd notice is the material roster. The original game gave you 5 things to break. Deadly Alliance nearly doubled that to 8. Bamboo, coal, oak, brick, redwood, marble, iron, and diamond. That's not just more content for the sake of padding, though. Each material represented a genuinely distinct tier of difficulty, and the progression from bamboo to diamond felt like climbing a mountain one ledge at a time. But here's where the mechanic itself actually evolved. In the original, you mashed buttons to fill a meter and hit block. Simple. Deadly Alliance changed the formula by requiring players to press all 4 controller buttons simultaneously and rapidly to build a power meter, then hit the R trigger to deliver the strike. That trigger press was a completely separate phase. You weren't just mashing anymore, you were mashing and timing. The original never asked you to split your focus like that. It sounds like a small addition on paper, but in practice it transformed the entire feel of the minigame. You could fill your meter perfectly and still blow it by mistiming the trigger. 2 skills instead of 1. And that's not even the biggest change. The real glow up was what you actually got for breaking those blocks. In the the 1992 original, Test Your Might padded your score. That's it. Points on a counter that meant absolutely nothing once you walked away from the cabinet. Deadly Alliance threw that entire philosophy out the window. Now, breaking blocks earned you coins, actual in-game currency that you spent in the crypt to unlock character skins, concept art, and finishing moves. Successful runs could award 355 ruby coins and 254 gold coins, and those weren't throwaway numbers. That was real purchasing power in the unlock economy. Overnight, Test Your Might went from an arcade novelty to a legitimate progression tool. You weren't breaking blocks for bragging rights anymore. You were breaking them because that diamond at the end of the gauntlet was standing between you and a fatality you hadn't unlocked yet. The mechanic finally had stakes that extended beyond the minigame itself. But here's the part that doesn't get enough credit. The difficulty design was genuinely smart. 6 of the 8 materials were very doable on a first attempt. Bamboo through redwood felt like a natural warm-up, each one slightly harder than the last, but never punishing. Marble and iron presented a real step up, the kind of difficulty that made you lean forward in your chair and actually focus. And then diamond sat at the top like a final boss, genuinely brutal, the kind of challenge that made your thumbs ache. The developers could have made failure devastating. They didn't. Deadly Alliance implemented a checkpoint system, so failing on marble sent you back to your last successful break, rather than all the way back to bamboo. That was a mercifully smart call. Without it, the difficulty spike at the top would have turned the entire gauntlet into a frustration. Instead, it felt fair. You could throw yourself at diamond over and over without losing 20 minutes of progress each time. This is what a proper comeback looks like. Test Your Might didn't just return after a decade of absence. It grew up. The mechanic got more complex in a way that felt earned. The rewards got meaningful in a way that actually motivated you to engage. And the difficulty curve respected your time instead of wasting it. Deadly Alliance proved that Test Your Might wasn't some relic of the arcade era that the franchise had outgrown. It was a feature that just needed the right game to reach its potential. But if you think Deadly Alliance pushed Test Your Might into new territory, wait until you see what happened when the franchise stopped being a fighting game entirely. Mortal Kombat, Shaolin Monks. Nobody expected the best version of Test Your Might to come from a game that wasn't even a fighting game, but that's exactly what happened. Mortal Kombat, Shaolin Monks dropped on September 16th, 2005, and it was a full genre departure. This wasn't a tournament fighter. It was a PlayStation 2 action-adventure beat-em-up, where you played as Liu Kang and Kung Lao, hacking your way through Outworld in a co-op campaign. Everything about the game was different. The camera, the combat, the structure, all of it. And Test Your Might changed with here's the thing. In the original arcade game, Test Your Might was a bonus round. In Deadly Alliance, it was a standalone tower challenge you could grind for coins. But in Shaolin Monks, it wasn't separated from the game at all. The mechanic was woven directly into the campaign itself, triggering organically whenever the story needed you to perform a feat of strength. You'd be running through a level, hit a blocked path, or a crumbling wall, and the game would throw a Test Your Might prompt at you like it was just another part of the action, because in this game, it was. But the mechanical changes went deeper than just context. The input system was completely reworked. You rapidly pressed X to fill a meter past a red mark on screen, then hit L1 to execute the strike. Simple enough on paper. But here's where it gets interesting. You didn't need to mash at maximum speed to succeed. For the first time in the mechanic's history, Test Your Might wasn't purely a hand-destroying speed test. You could build the meter at a measured pace, time your execution, and still clear the challenge. That shift alone changed the entire feel of the experience. It went from frantic arcade panic to something more deliberate, more cinematic. You felt like you were powering up for a devastating blow, rather than desperately trying to break your controller before a timer ran out. And the variety of how it showed up was the real star. Previous versions had you breaking materials. Wood, stone, steel, diamond, whatever. Always the same format, always the same framing. Shaolin Monks threw that entire template out. One moment you'd be smashing through a destructible statue, blocking your path. The next you'd be grappling an enemy and using the meter to generate enough force to hurl them across the arena. Environmental obstacles, contextual story beats, even moments where you needed raw power to push through a collapsing structure. Every single Test Your Might instance felt like it belonged to that specific scene rather than being copy-pasted from an arcade cabinet. But the boldest move was putting it inside boss fights. During certain encounters, Test Your Might would trigger mid-battle as a combat mechanic. You weren't pausing the action to play a minigame. You were using the mechanic as part of the fight itself, building meter to overpower a boss at a critical moment. The Baraka fight is probably the best example. Win the Test Your Might battle against him, and you could impale him by pressing R2 toward him. It added strategic texture to encounters in a way no previous version had even attempted. Suddenly, Test Your Might wasn't just about about proving you could press buttons fast. It was about when you triggered it, how you used it, and what happened after you succeeded. The philosophical shift here is massive when you step back and look at it. From 1992 through Deadly Alliance, Test Your Might was fundamentally a game design artifact, a leftover from the arcade era that existed because it had always existed. It was fun, sure, it was iconic, absolutely, but it was never essential. You could remove it from any previous Mortal Kombat game, and the experience wouldn't meaningfully change. Shaolin monks made it essential. By embedding the mechanic into the campaign's pacing, the developers turned Test Your Might into a narrative tool. It punctuated story moments. It made the player feel powerful at exactly the right times. It created rhythm within levels, breaking up combat sequences with moments of focused intensity that felt earned rather than random. The wall you smashed through wasn't just an obstacle, it was a dramatic beat. The boss you overpowered wasn't just a health bar you depleted, it was a moment of triumph that you physically felt through the controller. And somehow, a beat-em-up spin-off that most people forgot about accomplished something that 13 years of mainline Mortal Kombat games never did. It made Test Your Might feel like it was designed for the game it was in, rather than imported from a different one. But if Shaolin monks proved the mechanic could evolve beyond its arcade roots, the next game in the franchise was about to test whether it could survive a completely different kind of transformation. Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe. Everything you knew about Test Your Might just got thrown through a wall, literally. On November 16th, 2008, Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe launched, and it didn't just tweak the formula, it gutted it. The blocks? Gone. The materials? Gone. The entire concept of standing over an object and smashing downward through it? Completely removed from the equation, and what replaced it was something so fundamentally different that the community is still arguing about whether it even deserves the name. But here's the thing. What they built in its place was genuinely clever. In MK vs. DC, Test Your Might triggered mid-combat. You'd throw your opponent into a wall during a fight, and instead of the normal knockback animation, the game would suddenly shift into a button mashing sequence. The attacker's job was to hammer buttons as fast as possible, driving the opponent through wall after wall after wall, racking up extra damage with each one. The harder you mashed, the more walls they crashed through, and the more health they lost. But the defender wasn't just sitting there watching it happen, they got to mash too. This is where the mechanic got interesting. While the attacker was furiously pressing buttons trying to maximize damage, the defender was doing the exact same thing trying to minimize it. Every wall the defender successfully resisted was damage they didn't take. Every wall the attacker forced through was punishment earned. It turned what could have been a one-sided beatdown into a simultaneous tug-of-war, both players hammering away at their controllers at the same time, fighting over who controlled the outcome, and nobody could figure out the optimal way to do it. When the game launched, forums exploded with confusion. Do you mash all 4 face buttons at the same time? Do you press them in sequence? Does it matter which buttons you hit first? Players tested both approaches obsessively, and the community consensus eventually landed on simultaneous mashing as the most effective strategy. Just slam all 4 buttons as fast as your hands can physically move. But here's the weird part. Sequential pressing seemed to work too. The game never explicitly told you which method was correct, so players were left reverse engineering the mechanic through trial and error while their thumbs went numb. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Was this actually Test Your Might? Because if you strip away the name, what you're looking at is a wall collision combat mechanic with competitive button mashing. There are no materials. No wood, stone, steel, ruby, or diamond. No gauge to fill before striking downward. No character standing over a block preparing to karate chop through it. The visual language, the structure, the entire presentation is completely different from anything the minigame had been before, and purists noticed immediately. The argument split the fanbase cleanly in two. On one side, you had players who said this wasn't Test Your Might at all. It was a new mechanic wearing an old name. The identity of the minigame had always been about breaking increasingly difficult materials, and without that core element, calling it Test Your Might felt like false advertising. You wouldn't call a foot race a swimming competition just because both involve going fast, but on the other side, you had players making an equally valid point. The underlying spirit was identical. Two players furiously pressing buttons to determine who wins a physical contest of strength. That's the DNA of Test Your Might distilled to its purest form. The blocks were never the point. The contest was the point. And MK vs. DC delivered that contest in a way that actually made sense within a fighting game's flow, rather than pulling you out of combat entirely for a separate minigame. Both sides had legitimate arguments, and honestly, both sides were right. The wall mechanic worked brilliantly as a fighting game feature. It added stakes to positioning near walls, created dramatic mid-fight momentum swings, and and kept both players engaged during what could have been a passive animation. Watching your opponent crash through 3, 4, 5 walls because you outmashed them felt satisfying in a way that breaking a diamond block never quite captured, because this time there was a human being on the other end losing because of your effort. But it also felt like a spiritual successor rather than a direct continuation. The execution was so radically different that it almost functioned as a separate mechanic entirely, one that happened to share a name with something from 1992. It's the Ship of Theseus problem applied to a fighting game minigame. If you replace every single component of Test Your Might except the competitive button mashing, is it still Test Your Might? The franchise never really answered that question. It just moved on, and what came next would answer it by doing something nobody expected, going all the way back to the beginning. Mortal Kombat, 2011. After years of reinvention, Test Your Might finally came home. Released on April 19th, 2011, the Mortal Kombat reboot didn't just bring back the franchise's identity, it brought back the minigame that helped define it. And this time, it had a proper stage to perform on. The game introduced the Challenge Tower, a gauntlet of roughly 300 challenges that threw every kind of test at the player. Standard fights, modified rule sets, bizarre gimmick rounds, and scattered throughout at regular intervals. Test Your Might. But here's what made it feel fresh. The material roster got a complete overhaul. Gold, Amber, Sapphire, Titanium, and several others replaced the old lineup, giving the minigame a visual and mechanical refresh without abandoning the format that made it iconic in 1992. You still mashed buttons. You still watched a meter climb. You still slammed your fist through something solid. It just looked better, hit harder, and felt like it belonged in a modern game rather than being an arcade relic stapled onto one. But the Challenge Tower didn't just house Test Your Might, it shaped it. Every single challenge in the tower was locked to a pre-selected character. You couldn't pick your main and coast through on muscle memory. Whatever fighter the game assigned to that specific challenge was the fighter you used, period. This meant that every player who reached Challenge 50 or 150 or 294 had the exact same experience. Same character, same material, same difficulty threshold. And that created something genuinely rare in fighting games. A completely level playing field for community discussion. When someone said Challenge 294 is impossible, everyone knew exactly what they meant, because everyone faced the identical setup. And Challenge 294 deserves its own moment here, because it was the mountain. Diamond, the absolute final, Test Your Might in the entire Challenge Tower, sitting near the tail end of a 300+ challenge progression. Everything before it was training. This was the exam. The meter threshold for Diamond sat so high that casual button mashing wasn't going to cut it. You needed speed, consistency, and frankly, hands that hadn't already been destroyed by the previous 293 challenges. But here's where it gets genuinely absurd. The difficulty of the later Test Your Might challenges didn't just test your patience, it tested the physical limits of what a human being could do with a standard controller. Some players reported that regular gamepads simply weren't fast enough, switching to arcade sticks to get the mashing speed they needed. Others went further, way further. Players documented placing batteries between their controller buttons and rolling them back and forth to simulate rapid presses faster than their fingers could manage. One player openly admitted to using fabric draped over the buttons so their fingers could glide with less friction, reducing the resistance that was slowing them down. These weren't joke strategies, these were genuine workarounds born from the realization that the minigame was demanding inputs faster than comfortable human execution could reliably deliver. And honestly, that's kind of beautiful in a twisted way. The fact that a button-mashing minigame from 1992 had evolved to the point where people were engineering household solutions to beat. It says everything about how seriously players took the challenge. It wasn't that Diamond was impossible, it was that Diamond was just barely possible enough to make you believe the next attempt would be the one. That's the most dangerous kind of difficulty. Not the kind that makes you quit, but the kind that makes you try one more time and then 40 more times after that. But the real stroke of genius wasn't the difficulty, it was what happened when you failed. In previous games, failure meant a silent reset or a generic buzzer. Maybe your character's arms crumpled against the material and you hit retry. Mortal Kombat 2011 did something different. When you failed a Test Your Might challenge, the narrator laughed at you. Not a subtle chuckle buried in the mix. An audible, taunting laugh directed squarely at your failure. It was petty, it was mean-spirited, and it was absolutely brilliant because it turned every failed attempt into a personal insult. Players didn't retry because they wanted to progress. They retried because they refused to let a disembodied voice mock them and get away with it. That single audio cue probably generated more retries than any reward system ever could. The combination of locked characters, escalating materials, physical difficulty that broke controllers and human hands alike, and a narrator who actively bullied you for failing created something the series hadn't achieved before. before. Test Your Might wasn't just a nostalgic callback in the 2011 reboot. It was an event, a community-wide shared struggle where everyone hit the same wall, everyone heard the same laugh, and everyone either broke Diamond or died trying. The minigame had returned to its material-breaking roots, but it arrived with a personality and a difficulty curve that the original arcade version never dreamed of. But if the 2011 reboot brought Test Your Might back to its roots, the next entry took those roots and planted them in completely new soil. Mortal Kombat 1 2023, September 19th, 2023, PlayStation 5, Xbox Series, X Series S, Nintendo Switch, and PC. And for the first time in the franchise's history, Test Your Might doesn't just show up in one place. It shows up in two completely different contexts within the same game. You've got it as a mandatory progression gate in story mode, where certain chapters literally will not let you continue until you pass the challenge. And then you've got it woven throughout Invasions mode, where it functions as an entirely separate minigame system with its own unlock structure and trophy rewards. But here's the thing, neither of those contexts is what people actually remember about this version. What people remember is the animations. Every single character in Mortal Kombat 1 has a unique Test Your Might attack animation, and some of them are genuinely unhinged. Ashra steps up and slashes the target with her carries, her sacred dagger, treating the whole thing like a purification ritual. Kenshi doesn't even touch the block himself. He telepathically commands his ancestral sword, Sento, to fly forward and strike the target for him, because apparently, even minigames are beneath his hands. Shang Tsung channels raw soul magic into the impact, turning what used to be a generic karate chop into something that looks like it belongs in a fatality. And then there's Havik. Havik, the Chaos Cleric, the man who treats his own body like a suggestion rather than a requirement, rips off his own head and uses it as the striking implement. His severed head is the weapon. He beats the block with his own skull. That is not a joke. That is a real animation that a team of developers sat down, storyboarded, modeled, rigged, and animated. And it is the single greatest Test Your Might moment in 30 years of this mechanic existing. But these character animations aren't just funny. They represent something the franchise has been building towards since the original arcade cabinet. Test Your Might finally stopped being a generic minigame that any character could sleepwalk through. The blocks aren't anonymous anymore. They're character moments. Every fighter approaches the challenge differently because every fighter is different, and the minigame finally reflects that. It took 3 decades, but Test Your Might became personal. Now, the input system changed again, and this time the shift is genuinely interesting from a design perspective. Previous versions had you hammering all 4 face buttons simultaneously, just mashing everything as fast as your hands could physically move. Mortal Kombat 1 threw that out. Instead, players press the buttons in rapid sequence. On Xbox, that's A, B, Y, X. On PlayStation, triangle, circle, square, cross. You're not smashing anymore. You're performing a rhythm. That's a subtle but massive philosophical change. There's a rhythm game influence creeping into a mechanic that's been pure brute force since 1992. The skill expression shifted from how fast can your fingers physically vibrate to how cleanly can you cycle through a pattern under pressure. It rewards coordination over raw speed, which means players who struggled with the pure mashing approach in previous games suddenly had a fighting chance. But players who relied on sheer button mashing velocity found themselves dying repeatedly because sloppy inputs don't register the same way. And speaking of dying, the feedback system got its biggest overhaul in franchise history. The meter now displays an explicit safe zone with clear minimum and maximum thresholds visible on screen. You build your meter by pressing the sequential buttons, and when you think you're in the zone, you hit R2 on PlayStation or RT on Xbox to strike. But here's the catch. If you press that trigger outside the safe zone, your character doesn't just fail, they die instantly. The block kills them. Now, before you panic, the game immediately revives you to retry. There's no permanent punishment, you don't lose progress or resources, but that instant death animation hits different psychologically. Watching your fighter get obliterated because you mistimed a button press by half a second creates genuine tension that previous versions never achieved. The stakes feel real even though they technically aren't. It's brilliant design, high consequence, zero permanent cost. You feel the pressure without ever feeling punished. The Invasions mode built an entire progression structure around Test Your Might that treated the minigame as legitimate content rather than a side attraction. Players needed to complete 5 unique Test Your Might encounters scattered across the mode's 7 different mesas before they could unlock the dedicated minigame tower. That tower contained its own challenges, its own rewards, and its own associated trophies. This wasn't something you stumbled into between fights. It was gated content you had to actively work toward across multiple play sessions and multiple areas of the Invasions map. But the difficulty is where things got genuinely wild. Some Test Your Might encounters in Mortal Kombat 1 are completely casual friendly. friend. You press the buttons at a reasonable pace, hit the trigger inside a generous safe zone, and the block shatters without drama. These encounters exist for players who want to experience the mechanic without developing carpal tunnel syndrome. They're approachable, they're fair, and they respect the player's time. Then there's the Tower Challenge. One specific Test Your Might encounter in the tower earned a community reputation almost immediately as the hardest Test Your Might in Mortal Kombat 1. The safe zone shrinks to almost nothing. The sequential input speed required borders on inhuman. Players posted videos of attempt after attempt after attempt, fingers cramping, controllers creaking, that death animation playing on loop like a horror movie. Forum threads filled with strategies, timing breakdowns, and genuine frustration from players who could handle every fight in the game but couldn't crack this single minigame challenge. And that variable difficulty model is actually the smartest thing the franchise has ever done with this mechanic. For 30 years, Test Your Might had a consistency problem. Either it was too easy and felt like filler, or it was too hard and felt like punishment. Mortal Kombat 1 finally said, why not both? Easy encounters for casual players who just want to see Havoc hit something with his own head. Brutal encounters for veterans who want to prove they can survive anything the franchise throws at them. Two audiences, one mechanic, variable difficulty. After 3 decades of trying to find the right balance, this might genuinely be the definitive version. And when you step back and look at the full picture, from a pixelated karate chop on an arcade cabinet in 1992 to Havik using his own severed skull as a weapon in 2023, the evolution is staggering. The inputs changed from simultaneous mashing to sequential rhythm patterns. The feedback evolved from a simple meter to an explicit safe zone with instant death consequences. The animations went from one generic chop shared by every character to fully unique, personality-driven attack sequences for every single fighter on the roster. The difficulty shifted from a fixed curve that served nobody perfectly to a variable model that tries to serve everyone simultaneously. Test Your Might isn't a relic. It's not a nostalgia checkbox that developers include because they feel obligated to honor the past. It's a living, breathing part of Mortal Kombat's identity that keeps finding new ways to challenge players, express character personality, and push its own boundary. 30 years in, and the mechanic is still evolving, still surprising people, still making them laugh when Havoc shows up with his own head in his hands. And honestly, that's the most Mortal Kombat thing imaginable. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.